Good morning. I hope everyone is fine hearing this. My name is Chung Min Lee, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm here today in Seoul with my colleagues to launch officially the report which rolled out a couple months ago. Before I start, let me also say that on behalf of all of my friends at Carnegie, that I am deeply saddened by the recent turn of events in the US. And I hope that people who are watching this both in the US and abroad understand that this really is one of those rare tipping points in American history. But regardless, I'm very saddened by the level of violence that we've seen and hope it will abate very, very soon. The Korea Net Assessment Report came out, as I said, a couple of months ago. And I asked a number of really top specialists, both in the US and Korea, to talk about and to write about the current security dynamic on the Korean Peninsula. And so today I'm very, very lucky with the help of Alex Taylor and our great comms team at Carnegie to do an official launch on the web, and as well as to have an opportunity to discuss what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, particularly on military, strategic, and intelligence issues as we move forward. So what I would like to do over the next hour is to briefly introduce our panelists, although there are two others who were not able to join us live today. And then I will begin by giving brief presentations. I will ask each of our four presenters to speak for about 5 minutes or so. And then I'll take basically some questions. But before that, I would like to engage our group in a discussion on what they think are the most critical issues. And so without further ado, let me just go down the list. And I hope you can see on one of my boxes here, Brian Port. He is a civilian strategist at DoD, currently Deputy Director of the Commander's Action Group in the U.S. Army's Futures Command. He has had extensive tours in Korea, 3 in total, some 14-odd years, and is one of the leading, I guess, practitioners of Korean security in the U.S. Army. And so we're really glad that Brian was able to join us both as an author and as a panelist in this program. Gina Kim, she's a research fellow and chief of the North Korean Military Division at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. And KAIDA, as it is more well known in Korea and abroad, is perhaps Korea's best defense think tank, period. And Gina, as one of the rising stars or risen stars, is the person to go to in terms of assessing North Korean military affairs. She has written a number of great articles, including a book on the North Korean WMD program. And I'm very happy that Gina was able to join us today. Last but not least, my co-editor, Catherine Botto. She's a research analyst at the Carnegie Endowment. She also spent a couple of years in Korea studying as well as working in the U.S. Armed Forces Korea. We have co-authored and co-edited a number of reports on Korean unification, on political assessments in Korea, and now the first Korea Net Assessment. Katie is one of those rare birds who really understands Japan, Korea, China, as well as the US. And I'm sure that we will all be hearing and listening to her more in the months and years ahead. So welcome, panelists. And so what I would like to do is just go down what I think are the more germane points on each of our chapters. There's no conclusion, obviously. And let me also say to our viewers worldwide that every single thing that we wrote in the report and all the comments we are making today are totally our own personal views. They have nothing to do with either the US government, the Korean government, the militaries of both the ROK and the US, or the think tanks that Katie and I work for. And all the reports, all the assessments were made totally based on open sources. So once again, this is something that I think I wanted to share with our viewers. But just quickly, what I really want to do is go over some of the more critical points in my chapter. And if you imagine the Korean Peninsula as two, there's a North Korea and South Korea, obviously. And until now, the balance has been maintained by robust deterrence and defense on the South Korean side. We have 28,000 US forces as we speak, although numbers fluctuate on a monthly basis. And thus far, for the last 70 years, the alliance has been one of the most successful, I would argue, in the Asia Pacific. But what has happened over the last 10 years, particularly under the leadership of Kim Jong Un, that North Korea has become a de facto nuclear weapon state. She is not a de jure nuclear weapon state, but North Korea is on the verge of becoming a critical nuclear power. And so the strategic balance on the Korean Peninsula, in my personal view, has already begun to shift. And this shift, however, is also coinciding with a really big, I guess, surge in Chinese military power. And so we have a rising China with even more, I would argue, offensive capabilities than ever before, and a North Korea with growing WMD assets. And the third key point that I mentioned in my chapter, however, is the fact that although both of us are, of course, democracies, and we have to listen and march to our political leaders' commands, my take on this is that we have never seen such leaders in office, either in Washington or in Seoul. And I think President Trump deserves credit for opening a new roadmap with North Korea's Kim Jong Un. But at the same time, in my view, he has exacerbated tensions because of his really personal ties of diplomacy with Kim Jong Un. And despite his tweets and his remarks, North Korea's nuclear program, in fact, has gotten even worse under his watch. For the last 3 years, North Korea is working on a number of strategic assets, WMD, and Kim Jong Un just said, about a week ago, that his mission is to increase North Korea's nuclear capabilities. Now, on the South Korean side, President Moon came into office in May 2017, hoping to engage North Korea. He was successful. He held 3 critical summits with Kim Jong Un in 2018. And the hope was that in 2019 and 2020, we would see a roadmap towards denuclearization. Well, that has not yet happened. And so what I worry about more than anything else is the politicization of intelligence from a US perspective and the politicization of assessments from a South Korean perspective. On the ground, despite what our political leaders say, I don't think things have really changed. In other words, the military situation on the Korean Peninsula, in my view, has gotten worse over the last 3 years. And so this is the key issue that we have to grapple with. Obviously, there are many other views on this particular point. People may argue that North Korea's Kim Jong Un is serious about denuclearization. We shall have to wait and see. But as I said, those are my personal views. Now, what I would like to, then I will conclude my remarks by 2 final points. I think it's very important to remember that when we talk about the military balance on the Korean Peninsula, it is not just a here and now, but what we might expect in the next 5-10 years. And what I feel most concerned about is that Kim Jong Un is only 36 years old. He will outlive every single leader around him. He will be in power unless there is something, a disturbance that cuts off his regime. He will be in power for the next 20, 30 plus years, whereas Xi Jinping and others will be gone by the end of their natural terms. And so if you look at the trajectory, you will see a North Korea that has a robust political leadership with even more WMD assets over the next 5, 10 plus years. Last but not least, as I said earlier, and this is Gina's point more than mine, I believe that we are entering into a new phase in Korean security because of the rise of China and China's much more aggressive military stance. That will be, I guess, truly challenging for all of us. So let me stop there and move the floor over, as it were, to Brian, and then we'll go down the line. Brian, the floor is yours.
Jungmin, thank you, and thank you to Carnegie as well for this opportunity. I wish everybody here well. I mean, we're all struggling with, at least globally, COVID, and then of course here in the United States, as Jungmin alluded to, a situation of some considerable unrest. I do have to I'm required to, in a sense, reinforce or repeat the caveat that Jungmin offered, that I'm here in a private capacity, offering personal viewpoints, and that's certainly important to note. As I approached the project, I found the requirement. Well, I found the article to be sort of tough to write because of the requirement to look at a fairly short time frame in terms of military readiness, really trying to take a snapshot of a year, which is a difficult proposition because readiness is built upon multiple years of effort and obviously has implications in terms of what happens now and what will happen in the near to long-term future. So trying to bound this proved to be a challenge. Further, a challenge is trying to look really not just at the overall alliance picture, but to focus it down into something that's a little bit more military centric, which I think in the current age, and I think, Jungmin, some of your comments even alluded to this, can distort things a bit, not out of malice or out of a lack of effort to be sophisticated on our part, but just simply trying to focus in, you can lose some of the broader picture, and that has implications as well. So at the end of my remarks, I'll take a few seconds to reflect on a longer term horizon and a broader scope. But I think in the article, hopefully I brought this point out, that in a year time frame, despite some challenges on balance, alliance military readiness remains quite good. It is not without causes for concern. The alliance, and I hope I brought this out fairly clearly as well, is benefiting from, it's really drawing upon the accumulation of a decade of difficult choices, investments, and training. So in particular, from the years of, say, about 2007, 8, through about 17, 18, a lot of very hard choices were made, a lot of very important investments in not just capabilities, but also in training, and also in what I'll just call political military strategic alignment occurred. There certainly remain divergences within military sphere, but also, obviously we see as we contend with the rise of China, developments in North Korea, domestic politics in each of our countries, some other challenges, but still overall, it was a fairly positive story. I look at that 8-year period of time, especially now that I'm not as focused on Korean affairs and have a chance to kind of step back and get a perspective, and it is impressive. You can argue that perhaps it still isn't enough progress over that period of time, but impressive nonetheless. And we've been benefiting from that over the past year. And so if we have to degrade, decrease, alter some exercises over the course of a year, whether it's for the sake of allowing diplomacy some additional space, or whether now it's the issues that we will confront with things like COVID, it's weatherable. You can make adjustments, you can do other kinds of training, and it will not have a huge impact, provided that it is, in many respects, a limited period of time in which those alterations occur. In my article, I tried to take on the issue of what is readiness in the first place. I reviewed the complex command and control structures and relationships, each worthy of their own paper. And I suspect many who are listening to this right now are fairly well steeped in those things, so I'll not dwell on them. But I did use exercise as a proxy in which to examine what I defined as operational readiness. In my last 8-year assignment with USFK, I think I spent about 8 months on the ground, in CP Tango over the course of the different exercises. And so it pains me to admit that they're important. I would rather have been able to say they're not. We don't have to sit inside of a dank cave, and practice all these things, but we did. The exercises ensure that the different commands and their leadership structures and staffs understand and can rehearse the orchestration of large-scale military operations and operations plans. While we may wish that deterrence would prevent those things from having to be implemented, you can't assume that. Having 2 exercises of that scale allowed you not only to rehearse what we believe we will do based on plans, but also to experiment, to enable adaptation, and in particular, operational control transition, is one of those things that you would be adapting toward or to. I brought out in the article the issue of conditions-based. I believe that General Abrams, the current USFK commander, recently made statements along the same lines that a conditions-based approach is still the best way to proceed. But there again, the exercises are very important to enabling those conditions to be met, or even in the first place to be best defined. So we we'll begin to see some more serious impacts on readiness if we continue to see a decreased, altered scale or tempo of exercises. Switching gears just for a minute, where we may have seen some decrement on the exercise side in terms of military modernization on both the US and ROC militaries is a good news story. There's a lot of more capable systems that are being fielded, additional professionalization of forces, and that should serve both in terms of deterrence and, if necessary, the use of military force. Challenges remain, though, in terms of interoperability, and this within the larger alliance construct was and will remain an issue, particularly as weapon systems become more advanced, as the US, as I'm seeing these days, is working on a very sophisticated range of capabilities. It will not be a simple thing to try and just simply plug in something if it was not designed from the outset to be used and be compatible with US systems. And so that's something that South Korea is going to have to consider. Unfortunately, in some ways, more than the US, just simply by virtue of how much more the US invests in these issues and how much larger the US military is and will remain. Of course, North Korea is not standing still. That was covered elsewhere in the book. I mentioned it briefly, but neither is anyone else, as Jungmin alluded to, and as I believe Gina will speak about, whether it be the Chinese or the Russians, but also the US and South Korea continue to adapt to a complex environment. And so that's where I'll alter into or switch over into a few concluding ideas about long-term issues. The alliance has seen significant broadening over the past 7 decades, and in my original draft, had submitted to Jungmin that this is perhaps one of the most important alliances in world history, one of the most successful. I was maybe taken back a peg in terms of how we express that more in sort of post-war Asia, but when you consider its accomplishments and where South Korea has gone in 70 years, it is incredibly impressive, and it has been focused for the most part, despite broadening, on security and military interests. One can argue whether that was appropriate and whether we're changing and adapting quickly enough, and I think we should. The last major adaptation of command structures, for example, or for that matter, our political military approaches to alliance management came in 1978 with the establishment of CFC. And so in my final remark, I'll just say that we need to broaden out these structures that we have for the alliance into something that is not quite or only military centric by virtue of the United Nations Command and Combined Forces Command and USFK. It may be time to think about a secretariat that on a more permanent basis can think about the very quickly changing and very complex geostrategic dynamics of the region and even of the broader world, because this is a part of the world that simply has an outsized impact everywhere else, period. If war comes, even if it does not. So I'll conclude there, Jungmin.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Of course, we'll have a chance to come back to all the issues that you've alluded to. Gina, please go ahead.
Thank you. I thank Carnegie and Dr. Lee for giving me this chance to think about China factor to the security of the Korean Peninsula. Actually, for many years, many South Koreans saw China as a country to cooperate with to reduce tension on the Korean Peninsula, especially to denuclearize North Korea. However, seeing the competition between US and China, and especially China's military modernization, I came to think China is likely to see the Korean Peninsula as a theater of regional competition with the US and respond to developments on the Korean Peninsula in this way. I see China as a country to challenge the status quo of the regional security. In this regard, I argued in my chapter that changes in China's strategy and military posture is of great concern for South Korea. The point that I made in the chapter are threefold. First one is China's active defense strategy concept. China interprets active defense to include both de-escalation and seizing the initiative. China's defense white paper in 2015 shows a growing emphasis on China's forces' long-distance mobility operations. Indeed, China has gradually focused on projecting military power overseas with increasing amphibious and expeditionary warfare capabilities. China has sought to strengthen its ability to conduct joint operations, especially near the Korean Peninsula as well. So in this situation, South Korea has legitimate concern, I will argue, that the larger Northern Theater Command forces could quickly intervene in Northeast Asian affairs if necessary to protect China's own interest. In particular, South Korea's concern is a third-party intervention, especially by China in case of a contingency on the Korean Peninsula, because China may be in a better position to secure North Korea's WMD, and weapons facilities are very close to China's border. And China's quick mobilization can be a deterrence against the allied forces marching toward the north in a crisis. So I think South Koreans' concerns would be that Seoul does not have any established dialogue with Beijing on coordinated plans for Korean Peninsula contingency situations. Second point is China's development of diverse nuclear assets. China's increasing capabilities can possibly diminish strategic stability in this region, which could increase the risk of escalation in East Asia. This does not will serve South Korea's interest indeed in continuing talks these days on denuclearization and peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. Considering China's development of an asymmetric military capabilities, such as the medium and intermediate range ballistic and cruise missile forces, South Korea has serious concerns about the post-INF security environment. Bringing China to a future arms control framework, well, in my opinion, that does not seem feasible in the near future because China would be more interested in speeding up nuclear modernization, which can lead to US deployment of more assets in Asia, which then will further discourage North Korea from disarmament indeed. Besides, China will be very critical about South Korea's position on forward deployment of new US capabilities. It's a typical security dilemma for South Korea. The third point is China's more active military presence near the Korean Peninsula. China has increased its ability to conduct maritime reconnaissance missions, and the Chinese Navy has increased patrols near the Korean Peninsula. The number of cases of Chinese warships intrusion into South Korea's EEZ and violation of the Korean Air Defense Identification Zone actually surged significantly in recent years. As demonstrated by the airspace incursions by Russian strategic bombers and Chinese bombers in July last year in 2019. Well, I will say these practices can raise tension anytime in this region. And South Koreans are very much worried that the regular intrusion of Chinese aircraft may aim at testing ROG US joint military posture and response. So I propose that South Korea needs to be prepared to respond effectively to the possibility of small disputes with China and eventually to prevent any provocations in coordination with the US, in my conclusion. What South Korea needs is a better naval and air capabilities and improved, especially ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. I also emphasized in my chapter the importance of information sharing, policy consultations, and joint exercises between South Korea and the US. In addition, I believe it is in South Korea's interest to participate in security cooperation with US allies and partners who share fundamental values. At the same time, confidence building measures should be a key agenda between South Korea and China because increasing transparency and avoiding misperception that serves stability of the security environment in this region. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Changmin, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Gina. Above and beyond China, obviously there are other issues that concerns regional power, so we'll come back to you. Katie, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So my contribution to the Korean Net assessment focused on trilateral interoperability between the US, Japan, and South Korea. And in the paper, I get more deeply into the specifics of interoperability, but I think I'm going to focus a little bit more on cooperation because I don't want to get too in the weeds, and I think it's important not to conflate the two. But in my chapter, I tried to outline the political issues surrounding the trilateral relationship and what those political issues actually mean or do not mean for the security realities of the region. And I think this is a particularly interesting time to be writing something like this because, you know, we've always seen, of course, historical grievances and domestic political issues are a continuous stressor on relations between South Korea and Japan. But certainly in 2019, the lines between those domestic and historical issues and security and economic issues were really muddled. And I think the relationship between Japan and South Korea has probably seen its lowest point since perhaps even the normalization of relations in 1965. And I'd argue that this overlap of security and historical issues, to the degree we see it right now, marks a departure from the two countries' approach to one another over the past decade. There's always been domestic political rhetoric that's hostile, that's always persisted, but both nations have actually largely allowed security and economic cooperation to increase incrementally, but still quite substantially over the past few decades without resolving those issues. They're clearly close economic partners. The security relationship has evolved to include a number of cooperation mechanisms, from trilateral and multilateral exercises, high-level defense dialogues, participation in the Indo-Pacific Command Sanctions Enforcement Cell, intelligence sharing, and many other aspects. So I think it's important to underline, when we think about improvements in security cooperation and the existence of historical tensions between the two countries, those two things are not mutually exclusive. And that's borne out by the history of this relationship. And that's not to say that South Korea and Japan can achieve a high level of security cooperation without making progress on these historical issues. I definitely think there's a ceiling in terms of what can be achieved as those issues persist. It's not clear exactly where that is, but it will continue to be an issue. But in determining where the truth lies, I guess, in between the political and security realities in this relationship, I think it's really important to ascertain which aspects of cooperation are decently insulated from political volatility and which are not. And I think the past year has given us some insight into that. As a broad generalization, I'd say that bilateral forms of security cooperation between Japan and South Korea are far more vulnerable than trilateral ones that include the United States. And over the past year, we've seen a lot of cooperation initiatives deteriorate with the cancellation of things like port calls and senior level defense exchanges between Japan and South Korea in response to tensions between the two. And those are very unfortunate developments, but they're not the sort of thing that destroys an institution of cooperation that would be extremely difficult to rebuild. But on the other hand, the threat from South Korea to potentially withdraw from GSOMIA, the intelligence sharing pact between Seoul and Tokyo that allows them to share information directly rather than through the US as a conduit, that on the other hand, we've seen as quite vulnerable. So had that agreement fallen apart, that's an example of something that would have been extremely difficult to replace. Took years of negotiating, and to have that fall apart after so many years, I think it would have been very, very difficult to come back from. So I'm not sure how much exactly of the threat to withdraw was just posturing, but the fact that there is willingness that we saw to go that far in something that would probably have been so difficult to repair, I think is the most concerning thing to be watching right now. And that indicates that some bilateral agreements, even ones that we've gone through a lot of pains to negotiate, are quite vulnerable. But on the other hand, some of the most critical aspects of Japan's role in a Korean contingency are actually rather well insulated from political volatility. And a lot of that is because they're facilitated not necessarily through the bilateral relationship with South Korea, but more so codified in the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And of course, both of these alliances are very strong. And the mechanisms for cooperation in those relationships are far more institutionalized and developed. So a number of the significant ways that Japan can enable a US and South Korean response to a contingency with North Korea are codified in that framework, and therefore much more resilient. And when we talk about Japan's support, I'm not talking about anything like Japanese boots on the ground in South Korea, nothing like that. This refers more to rear area support functions, intelligence gathering, non-combatant evacuations, mine sweeping, et cetera. And those functions are extremely important to enable the US to respond to a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, especially as it relates to US force flow. That's because in any crisis on the peninsula, we would require significant augmentation from US forces outside of Korea, particularly air and naval enforcements, the most well-positioned of whom are in Japan. And what's more, we have a status of forces agreement with the government of Japan through the United Nations Command that allows not just the United States, but some UN sending states to transit troops and equipment and material through US bases in Japan to the Korean Peninsula in the event of a conflict. And this is something that the US can't do without the support of the Japanese government. So the US-Japan alliance and the fabric of that and the agreements that enable it are critically important to US troops even being able to make it to Korea should the need arise in a crisis. So this is just one of many ways in which Japanese cooperation enables and supports a US response to the North Korean threat. And those sort of things are not really very vulnerable to political volatility. So they're definitely more important and foundational forms of support that are in place that are pretty resilient. But that's not to say, obviously, there's still a lot of room for improvement. Particularly, the US can serve, it can be a conduit to a certain extent for cooperation between South Korea and Japan, but this sort of bifurcated relationship isn't really as coherent or effective as it could be. So using the United States as a facilitator is cumbersome. It takes more time, especially in a conflict scenario. It risks miscommunication. It makes coordination between the three militaries just more difficult. So getting some more resilient cooperation between South Korea and Japan within that trilateral framework, I think is very important to ensuring that we can insulate that relationship from more political volatility. And, additionally, I think while cooperation can arise on an ad hoc basis in a conflict scenario where it becomes very necessary, the cooperation we can establish during peacetime is far more vulnerable. And, we saw that with Jasomia and a lot of events over the past year. And if we allow that cooperation to deteriorate during peacetime, then that gives us a shakier foundation on which to work together in the event of a crisis. So, going forward, these very deep-seated historical issues are not something that we can resolve in the near term. So I think in the near to midterm, what we really need to be focusing on is in the trilateral relationship, creating more areas of cooperation that can be insulated from that political volatility. There's a lot more in the paper about the specifics of how to do that, the areas where we've seen success and failure, but I think I'll stop there.
Well, before I go on and ask questions, I also wanted to briefly mention that two other authors who are top-notch analysts in their own fields were not able to join us today. And Shinbom Chol, who is with he used to be at the Asan Institute. He is now at the Korea Research Institute for National Strategy. And his chapter is on how South Korea's own defense reforms and military policy under the Moon government have contributed to security planning. And then Kim Min-seok from the 중앙일보 focused on North Korea's military strategy and modernization. And his main point is that North Korea's general purpose forces are being hollowed out in many respects. And this is why Kim Jong Un is shifting much more of his resources to WMD. In the remaining time that we have, which is about 25 minutes, I'd like to ask each of the panelists some questions. Let me just go, as I said, originally go from Katie backwards. Katie, when you look at the future of trilateral cooperation between, South Korea, Japan, and the US, over the longer term, we will be facing even more stringent issues because of the looming China threat. And do you think that the Japanese, Korean, and US governments, on top of North Korea, will be able to coordinate their policies vis-a-vis the looming threat from China?
I think that's something that isn't well developed right now. And I think it's somewhat premature, not because the threat isn't serious right now, but because of the impact that trying to publicly, reorient the alliance and the trilateral alliance toward confronting China could have. I think obviously that's in the back of everyone's mind, like what is the purpose of both the US and Japan alliances in the absence of the North Korean threat. But I think the optics of exploring that too early might be more detrimental. But even so, in the future, I think one of the biggest things we need to be addressing in terms of trilateral interoperability is making sure that a lot of the ad hoc mechanisms that we have for cooperation right now become more institutionalized. So there are certain things like the defense trilateral talks between the US, Japan, and South Korea that's a mechanism that is pretty institutionalized. Even in 2019, with all of the tension going on, there was still a DTT. That's something that can continue even if there's tension. But a lot of other things, there's not really I think the last time that we had a trilateral missile defense exercise was in 2017, and there's not some sort of, schedule for those things. They occur on an ad hoc basis. A lot of our cooperation is like that. So I think finding more ways to really institutionalize these things so that you can say, okay, well, last year, this is what happened. This year, this is what we're seeing. What is the progress that we've made? Being able to set clear targets year on year. I think that's really important to developing the relationship in a way that's more sustained.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay. Gina, you focused on what's happening in China and their responses to both North Korea and South Korea. What we have seen recently, including, for example, the Chinese are, according to press reports, they're going to operationalize a new strategic bomber. They're modernizing their nuclear arsenals. And they've been much more aggressive in saying that South Korea's own defense efforts, including options with the US, is actually threatening to China. If that is true, over the next 10, 15-year horizon, as North Korea's threat increases, and as China's, military space increases in the region, what is the best possible way for the US and the ROK to meet this new challenge?
Well, I think it is crucial for the ROK in the US to invite North Korea and China to a multilateral dialogue for arms control in this region in the longer term, in 10 years and 20 years, because, well, there should be anyway strategic stability in this region. And neither North Korea nor China are part of this multilateral arms control or arms reduction treaty. So I think in order to keep some stability, there should be a new equilibrium that can be acceptable to everybody concerned. But the question is, well, I think the first question regarding this approach is, first of all, it is hard to agree upon a monitoring or a verification mechanism, because verification is very important to make sure that everybody are respecting the agreed framework once it is established. And the second problem that I see is no one knows what kind of equilibrium is best for everybody. So we must need to think about various types of concerns that we all actually have in the near future to agree on an equilibrium that can be possibly achieved by serious talks about arms control mechanism in this region.
Brian, you talked about readiness in your chapter, and I think that is one of the most important aspects of military planning that is least appreciated. In other words, it's like, training and exercises. These are really important aspects of battle readiness, but they're not really all that, snazzy. But if you look to the future of US ROK readiness on the peninsula and compare it to US readiness, in other theaters, whether it's in Europe or in the Middle East, although the US footprint is shrinking, how would you compare that, those readiness states?
That's a hard question because each of those theaters is very distinct. And so are the relationships, for that matter, with different allies in those parts of the world. I guess if you were to compare it to what's going on in the Middle East, I don't know that any place else in the world is going to reach, from a U.S. perspective, quite that level of readiness, simply because we have forces that are in combat or in very, very currently active conflict zones. And then the other distinction is maybe Europe is a better example than in this regard, considering the nature of what maybe the perceived threats are. You might have a closer analog, but the geography of Europe is also very different. And then consequently, so would be what we would look at in terms of readiness, as is the case with the number of allies in a different kind of threat. So I guess I'm just stumbling through that because I'm not really quite sure you could make a good comparison with the other theaters. I would try and benchmark it to a different set of standards that are more germane to what we would need to do in Korea in times of crisis or conflict. And
The reason I asked that, Brian, is basically because the U.S. as a world power has forces not only in Korea, but Japan, in Europe, although a smaller footprint, of course, in the Middle East and elsewhere. And so as a world power and that has critical interests all over the world, my main point is, will readiness in one theater affect readiness in another? Or are you fairly certain or confident that readiness in the Korean theater will remain fairly unchanged?
All right. Well, so obviously there's impacts. The more active conflict that's going on somewhere else, it's less a matter of readiness than more a matter of overall availability of forces, that could go to Korea. And so you would have to then, I guess, maybe examine the overall U.S. readiness model and whether we were going to mobilize reserve assets in particular to compensate if active duty units that were intended to be early into whatever emerging situation exists in Asia were otherwise deployed or recovering, for that matter, from a deployment in order to reset. So, there, you have other models that the U.S. employs to try and maintain readiness and evaluate its readiness, which these days is quite high across the board. The past several Army leaders, for example, chiefs of staff, have emphasized this. Right now, our dilemma is more in terms of, and I think this is really true of the alliance, how do you get the readiness versus modernization balance right? How much readiness now versus how much modernization for readiness later is the right equation. And I think, again, alluding to what I said, in a year perspective is one thing. Looking beyond that is where I think we should emphasize some attention. And that's one of the key questions. Are we going to take some risks in the near term by virtue of readiness decrements in order to make other investments in modernization and experimentation?
Katie, both you and Brian, of course, are in the U.S. now. And we are in the midst of the political season, although the COVID-19 pandemic has basically made all the candidates disappear. But if you are able to put on your political hat and you look into the next, let's say, 6 months, and assuming that there is a change in government, can you give us your sense of where the alliance might go under a second Trump administration and a Biden administration?
You want me to take that, or Brian?
Yes.
Katie, go ahead.
I don't want to put Brian in a spot because he is still working for the U.S. government.
Sure. Well, we are a nonpartisan think tank as well. It's really hard to say. I think the direction that the alliance, there's a lot of damage being done to the alliance right now, particularly with the special measures agreement discussions. And I think that, if the U.S. continues to take this transactional approach, not just with South Korea, but with all of our allies, I think that can be very damaging in the long term, especially when we think about something like the SMA. Okay, you are demanding more money. Where is that money coming from in South Korea's defense budget? In a lot of ways, it's coming from parts of the defense budget that we need to accomplish other goals that are very important to the alliance, like OPCON transfer, R&D, military modernization, stuff that goes towards that. It's not like they can really reduce the force sustainment budget. A lot of it is going to come from those future-oriented activities that in the long run actually could, reduce the financial burden of our relationship. Yeah. And so I think, if we continue in that direction, it's certainly not good. It's very difficult to predict right now what's going to happen in 6 months, but that's one of the biggest risks I see.
Okay. Gina, you talked about the longer term, I guess, projections in terms of South Korea's defense planning and regional powers. One, I think, and I think Brian also alluded to this, so I'll come back to Brian in a second. But Gina, looking ahead quickly, if you look into, for example, new weapons platforms like railguns, for example, hypersonic missiles, anti-aircraft carrier missiles, these are all systems that are being developed as we speak, including lasers that are able to shoot down drones, as we saw by the recent US Navy test. Is South Korea able to basically have its own RMA in these fields? Will it have the money to basically able to field these new defense systems that are able to meet a wider spectrum of threats? Or do you think South Korea will still be confined to its political space?
Well, first of all, I must say the coronavirus situation, the outbreak actually affects a lot of things, including defense budget.
Mhm.
Because there should be some revision of the government budget next year. So the first thing that was heavily affected by this change was actually R&D in defense industry. So currently we have defense reform, which pursues transferring ROC Army into a very streamlined and very advanced force in order to defend our nation and also to increase our defense capability, our indigenous defense capability against the threats from North Korea, because we haven't solved yet the denuclearization issues. So what we already had thought about was trying to modernize the old weaponry into a modern one. And we were thinking about also increasing the quality of the ROC Army. So we had that kind of plan. And at the same time, we had a specific plan to purchase more weapons from the US, for example, because our ISR assets, that's very crucial part of our defense capabilities. So we had a plan to purchase reconnaissance, monitoring, and information related systems from the US to increase our ISR technology. And that also improve our capability to respond to North Korea's threats. But the thing is, well, we are under budget limits, and we have to consider everything, including social rebuilding and focusing more on non-traditional security challenges that we're facing today. So, but I do believe when we recover all these difficulties, then well, we will be back on the right track, because we had a plan and originally to increase our defense capabilities. But so I told you about the longer term plan, which is talking more on a multilateral arms control mechanism in this region. But in the short term, I think South Korea and the US should focus more on deterrence capability against any threats from China and North Korea. Especially, we have to work on extended deterrence. And in order to increase the credibility of our deterrence against these kind of threats, I think R&D will be just number one priority. And the second thing that we have to think about is more close consultations between the ROC and the US in order to increase the credibility of our defense.
Okay, thank you, Gina. Brian, if you look into the future, the South Korean army is going to be shrinking from about 580,000 to about 500,000, depending on what figures you see. And so the ROK army is going to be slimmer, regardless of what's going to happen in post-pandemic world. In that sense, do you believe that the 28,000 US forces that are in Korea today, is that basically a ceiling that you feel is fairly unchanging? Will that be the figure that next administrations may use as a base? How do you see the number of US forces in Korea shifting or not shifting, depending on what the South Korean forces are going to do with their own demographic changes?
So if we were to take away the sort of more political and psychological components of how many US troops are on Peninsula for a moment, to me, it's less a matter of how many troops are on there and more a matter of what capabilities they bring
Mhm.
and what they can facilitate, especially on the part of a more sophisticated South Korean military, so that they can serve as effectively a combat multiplier, particularly as the South Korean military assumes more and more responsibilities. And then the next question is, what kinds of contingencies do you anticipate over what timelines in terms of how much warning might you have in order to bring more forces to bear? So whether that's the South Korean side activating reserves, for example, if it goes below, a 500,000 mark and has a reserve system, or whether it's the US bringing capabilities to the peninsula. So, I mean, I don't know that the 28.5 is a ceiling per se. I think both countries could decide to increase that if that was what was called for, and it made sense. I think, though, with touching on a point that I was going to bring up anyways, the changing nature of the sorts of military technologies that we're moving toward,
Mhm.
and that number really is not what I would focus on.
Okay.
And there's even bigger challenges when you look at things like hypersonic weapons in particular,
Sure.
in a lot of different regards.
Yeah.
Overall for the military balances, but even on the peninsula, and what the US in turn could do from a distance and how quickly it could do it changes under those scenarios, as does a range of other different modernization programs that are currently underway. I think you probably read about some of the stuff the Army is anticipating in the open press that increases ranges to weapon systems that we currently are fielding in some fairly dramatic fashions. And then the real story, though, quite frankly, isn't so much the weapon systems and sensors, although those are very important, but it's all the data and artificial intelligence related capabilities that are trying to be brought to bear to bring these different things together in some fairly impressive ways. And there, on the South Korean side, as long as the military is kind of keeping a pace and thinking about these things in terms of its own force development, then you wind up with a very potent mix of things that we could do as allies. It goes back in some ways to the interoperability question.
Okay. Well, as we wind down, I have a number of questions from the audience. So I'm going to give one question to each of our panelists. Please make your comments within 1 minute, and then I will wrap up. So Katie, this question is to you from Mark Tokola, I believe from KEI, and that is, will friction in the Korea-Japan relationship make it more difficult to move Kim Jong Un in the right direction?
Well, I think it certainly makes it more difficult to integrate Japan into any sort of diplomatic process, but I can't say that there was a lot of will to do that before anyways. And I think part of that is practical. I think that Moon Jae-in sees that, in Japan approaching this issue, Abe is pretty restrained based on the abductee issue. It's very hard for him to engage on any of this without having some sort of resolution to that. So the diplomatic utility for Moon to really try and integrate Japan into this process it's just not, the cost benefit maybe isn't there quite. So I don't know, I'm not sure that this really exacerbates that very much. I think Japan has been pretty thoroughly sidelined, both by the United States and by South Korea for a while.
Okay. This is to Gina, and the question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the North Korean military? Now, this is very interesting because North Korea says they have 0 patients. So Gina, very quickly, what has the pandemic done to North Korea's military?
We don't know. We don't know yet, because officially the North Korean government said there is no COVID case in North Korea.
Okay.
But well, like South Korea does these days, perhaps North Korean leadership may think about additional role for the military to defend their nations from non-traditional security threats like this COVID-19.
Okay. Brian, I think I have one more round and make it as brief as possible for all of us. The question is from one viewer, and that is, can we remove North Korea's nuclear deterrent? In other words, I think he or she is basically saying, what are the incentives that the US and the ROK can provide North Korea so that North Korea could give up nuclear weapons?
The question assumes, in a sense, that the North Korean nuclear weapons development is primarily about us. And I never have believed that's true. And I don't simply believe that North Korea is doing this for purely external security purposes. I think it's a very powerful and important, more important, frankly, domestic component. So I'm not sure that we can offer incentives in a sense, even if we did. The North Korean attitude has often been, or perspective, that they can't believe what we're offering anyway.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't view that as a sincere and sure enough set of commitments or incentives. So I don't know that we can simply offer them a set of incentives that would have this go away. Certainly a number of different US and South Korean governments have tried to figure that out. A lot of things have been offered in the past, and they simply haven't really yielded results.
Okay, as we wrap up, can I give our viewers last words, and then I will wrap up the entire session. So let's go with Katie as we wrap up the session. Is there something you want to share with our viewers that you feel is critical to understanding Korean security in the months and years ahead?
I mean, there are many there are many things I could say. I mean, I think when we think about Korea, Japan going forward, there are a few things that we should be looking at. I think a lot of us have assumed that the COVID-19 pandemic presents an opportunity for cooperation between a lot of countries, and that hasn't necessarily borne out. And I think we should be looking towards how that impacts the relationship between South Korea and Japan. We also need to be watching, I think within the next 3 months, I believe, there's going to be a decision in South Korea about what to do with the assets from Japanese companies involved in the forced labor disputes. In the next few days, we're expecting some sort of signaling or message from Japan to South Korea. They're asking for some decision on what to do about various trade restrictions lingering from 2019. So these are some things coming up that I think we should watch, and I'll just end with that. And also one thing, I'm not sure that the title of our publication is in the title of this event or anything. So I just want to plug that it's the Korea Net Assessment. Hopefully we can put it maybe in the description of this or the comments, but all of the authors, we're really happy and pleased with the work that everyone put in, Dr. Kim, Brian, Dr. Shin, and Kim Min-suk. So I hope, if there wasn't stuff that we covered in here, that everyone will have an opportunity to check out our publication. Shameless plug for that, but we did work very hard on it. So.
Gina, last words?
Well, and actually, I don't think that North Korea will just right away fire ICBM or SLBM, because the best strategy for North Korea is to buy time to continue R&D, because the current talk on denuclearization does not cover research and development of new technology. So I think North Korea's best strategy is to just motor through the situation by showing to the outside world that the no deal situation does not create any cost for the regime. So North Korea is doing that. But at the same time, I think R&D is one thing, but in mass production of the new type of system is another thing. So I think we have to focus more on controlling strategic trade that can be happening between North Korea and the rest of the world.
Brian, famous last words?
Yeah, what we need most of all right now between the allies are some hard discussions and dialogue about the fundamental nature of our interests and how they align and where they diverge, how we can get them to converge.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank all of our contributors, including the 2 persons who were not able to join us today, and of course to the 3 outstanding panelists and authors. And let me thank you for all the work that you put in for the last, over a year. And Katie, for all the great work that you did in Washington, making all this happen. And Brian, thank you for writing a great chapter, despite the fact that we asked you to change it several times. And as a current member of the U.S. Army, I'm sure it was difficult to write this chapter, but you did a superb job. And ditto with Gina. My final word is this: the Alliance will always face political challenges and difficulties, much more than we are feeling it today. But as the political temperature increases, it falls on the shoulders of day-to-day alliance managers, including people like Brian and Gina in the government or semi-governmental roles, and people like Katie and I outside of government, to make sure that we are able to present a robust rationale for maintaining one of the most successful alliances in the history of the US and South Korea. So going forward, I'm sure that we have many more reports to write. Let me thank once again our great comms team at Carnegie. And once again, thank you to all of you in Washington and Seoul for sharing your valuable insights. So we're signing off, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.